Muted.
Okay.
Okay, I'm back.
Good morning, everyone. I'm wondering if you can hear me. This is John Most, President of Media Associates International, and I'd like to welcome you to this month's MEI training webinar, Even Dr. Seuss Needed an Editor, The Art of Editing Books for Children, led by Stephanie Rische. MEI has a real passion for seeing the creation of excellent children's books all around the world, and so we're excited to be offering this training webinar today, and we're honored and grateful that Stephanie has agreed to share her expertise with us. Just a word about Stephanie. She's Senior Editor and Team Manager for Nonfiction and Children's Books at Tyndale House Publishers, located near Chicago, USA. Prior to that, she taught 8th grade English and she edited curriculum for several years. Actually, she's worked for the past 13 years in various editorial roles, from copy editing to developmental editing, so she's really speaking to us out of the heat of battle from her experience. She also blogs at stephanierische.com if you'd like to check that out after the webinar. And her new book, titled I Was Blind Dating, But Now I See, released in February of this year. Stephanie, when she's not working with words, enjoys listening to her husband Daniel play the guitar. She bikes along the river near her home and volunteers with the refugee ministry at her work. Now, everyone who registered for the webinar, you should have received in advance 2 handouts that Stephanie will be referring to today. If for some reason you didn't receive those handouts, please email MAI at mai@litworld.org, and we'll be glad to send them to you later. And of course, everybody who has registered for the webinar will receive afterward a link to the audio recording of the webinar. If you'd like to listen and share it with your staff, I'd encourage you to do that, to share it with others as well. And those of you who've done these webinars or participated before know that you can chat during the webinar. You can type in questions in the text box below that Stephanie will be aware of, that she may answer in progress as the webinar proceeds or at the end. So please keep your questions in mind and feel free to ask those questions to Stephanie. Take full advantage of her leading us today. So Stephanie, without further ado, I'd like to just turn this over to you. Even Dr. Seuss Needed an Editor, The Art of Editing Books for Children.
Great. Thank you so much, John, and welcome everyone. I'm so glad to be talking to you today. It's early morning here in Chicago, but I'm guessing that wherever you are, it may be evening or afternoon or different times. So thank you so much for taking the time to tune in, and I'm so looking forward to our conversation today. Well, as John said, I've been at Tyndale House Publishers for 13 years now, and in preparation for our talk today, I decided to count how many children's books I've worked on in those 13 years. And I looked at my bookshelf, which is behind me. I don't know if you can see it in the camera behind me, but I've worked on 114 different children's books in the time I've been at Tyndale, and it's such a privilege for me. I love children and I love children's books, and so to be able to work on kids' books that have an impact on the kingdom is such a privilege. And also last year I wrote a children's book myself, and I'll show it to you here. It's called My Princesses Learn to Be Brave. And that was such a wonderful experience for me to see it from a writer's point of view. You know, I've been editing for all these years, but it's a different experience to look at a blank screen and try and come up with words. So I think that gave me new empathy for my authors and kind of showed me the writing side as well as the editing side. Well, my connection with MAI, I attended Lit World for the first time last November, and it was such a wonderful experience for me. I met many of you. I'm recognizing some of the names of people who are assigned on today, and I just learned so much from editors and writers around the world, and it was a wonderful experience for me, and I'm looking forward to learning from you today in our conversation. I know it's going to be too short, and I wish I could see all of you and interact with you afterwards, but this is better than a flight trip around the world, so we'll go with it. Well, I'm so excited to talk to you about children's books today. This is a topic I'm really passionate about, if you can't tell already. Editing books is not just for children is not just something I do for my work. It's something that I love in my own life too. I have 5 nieces and nephews, and I also volunteer with the refugee ministry through my church, and we have a Bible club for kids ages 3 to 10. And so I love being able to work on books and have those images of those children in my mind to know what they're struggling with, what they're going through, and how these books might be able to help them, and then be able to give them these books when I'm finished working on them. And I think books provide a unique opportunity to teach kids about God and his character at a young age. And these books can help form a foundation of faith for these kids, and build in them a love for the Bible that can last their whole life. So I think that's something that is a bigger picture vision of what we do. It's not just working with words. It's not just figuring out costs. There's a deeper spiritual impact that we can have with the books we work on. And sometimes in the midst of deadlines and all the challenges we face, we can lose sight of that. So I just want to remind you that what you do is so important, and thank you for what you're doing. Well, the title of this session is Even Dr. Seuss Needed an Editor, and Dr. Seuss is a very well-known and beloved name in the United States, but in case you haven't heard much about him, I'll give you a little background about him, and we'll use his life and his experiences with his editors as kind of a jumping off point for our conversation today. Well, Dr. Seuss was born Theodore Seuss Geisel. He was born in 1904, and by the time of his death, he had published 60 books. And those books sold a total of 600 million copies by the time of his death, and they've been translated into 20 different languages. And for any of you writers out there or aspiring writers, you should know that his first children's book was rejected by at least 20 different publishers before it was published. So don't lose hope. There may still be a publisher for you if that's the spot you find yourself in. I would like to read an excerpt for you from Which Pet Should I Get, which is the last book that Dr. Seuss's that was published. And this will kind of give you a flair for what his writing style is like in case you haven't read this book or in case you haven't read any other books by him. I'm not sure if you can see the pictures, but I'll do my best here. We want a pet. We want a pet. What kind of pet should we get? Dad said we could have one. Dad said he would pay. I went to the pet shop. I went there with Kay. And so we went in. I took one fast look. I saw a fine dog who shook hands, so we shook. So I said I want him. But then Kay saw a cat. She gave it a pat, and she said, I want that. Then Kay said, now what do you think we should do? Dad said to pick one. We cannot take home 2. Then what do you know? We saw 2 other kinds. Now how could Kay and I make up our minds? A pup and a kitten, they look like good fun. Now which would we pick? We could only pick one. The cat or the dog, the kitten, the pup. Oh boy, it is something to make a mind up. Well, I won't spoil the ending for you, but the children go on to see a bird, a rabbit, a fish, and much silliness and hilarity ensue before they finally make their decision. And I won't tell you which pet they end up getting. You'll have to read it to find out for yourself. But that kind of gives you an idea of Dr. Seuss's style, of his art and his rhymes and his just fun, quirky style of writing. Well, Dr. Seuss saw it as his calling in life to use his words and his art to entertain and educate children. And those are important goals for sure, but we have an even higher calling than that. Yes, our books should entertain kids and they should engage and be fun for kids. But as Christian writers and publishers and editors, we know that our books have the potential to reveal truths about God and his character to children. And that's the most important calling we have. I want to just read some words by Jesus about what he thought about children to kind of frame our conversation today. This verse is from Matthew 19:13-15. One day some parents brought their children to Jesus so he could lay his hands on them and pray for them. But the disciples scolded the parents for bothering him. But Jesus said, let the little children come to me. Don't stop them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to those who are like these little children. And he placed his hands on their heads and blessed them before he left. And I think it's really interesting that Jesus never told children that they should act more like grown-ups. but he did tell adults that they should be like children. Jesus clearly had a special place in his heart for children, and that's one of the reasons it's such a privilege for us to do what we do. Not only do we have the opportunity to teach children about God, but we have a lot to learn from them about what it is to have childlike faith and about what God's character is like. According to a 2009 study by Rutgers University, people's deepest held beliefs about faith and the soul generally match the beliefs they form by the age of 10. And that serves as a sober reminder to me that children's books provide a unique opportunity for building a strong foundation of faith in kids. And when we can teach them truths about God's character and help them fall in love with God's word, it provides a foundation of faith that can last their whole life. And it's also a wonderful tool for parents and teachers and grandparents to connect with their kids and have spiritual conversations with their kids. So this topic is important. Children's books are important, and what we do matters with eternal significance. Well, as John said, we have chat available, so please feel free to jump in anytime with questions. It's so strange for me not to be able to see your faces and not know if you're falling asleep or if I'm boring you to death. So feel free to jump in with questions, and I'll try to catch those as we go. And there will also be time for questions at the end. So I would love to hear your thoughts about things you've learned about children's book editing along the way as well. Well, our main topic for today is what makes a good children's book editor. And I have 4 ways that I'm going to suggest, and I'd love to open that up for other ideas at the end. First of all, to be a good children's book editor, you need to be able to challenge the author. Early in Dr. Seuss's career, Life magazine published a report that said that many children in the United States were poor readers, and they did some investigation about why that was. And what they decided was that largely it was because children's books were too boring. Their kids just weren't engaged, they weren't excited to read, and there just weren't good resources out there that would teach kids and be fun. So Dr. Seuss's editor at Houghton Mifflin compiled a list of 350 words that he felt were important sight words that kids in first grade should be able to recognize. And then he gave the list to Dr. Seuss, and he challenged him to trim that list down to 250 words and write a book using only those 250 words. And his challenge to Dr. Seuss was this: bring back a book children can't put down. And 9 months later, Dr. Seuss came back with a book called The Cat in the Hat, which is arguably one of his most famous books that he's ever written. And that book used only 236 of the words on his editor's list. Well, one of the unique challenges about children's books is that they do need to be instructive and engaging. It's not enough to present facts to kids. The books need to win their hearts as well. And I think this is even more so the case when it comes to Christian books. While it's certainly important for kids to have head knowledge about faith and the Bible, the best books need to engage them on an emotional level and a spiritual level as well. Those are the kind of stories and books that stick with them, and they carry with them their whole life. And this is often where an editor can come in to help an author. Sometimes authors are so close to their own message and their own project, and they need someone else to give them the reminder that this is not just about communicating information and facts, but the books need to have a winsomeness to them, and they need to have that magical reread quality where kids and parents want to keep coming back to the book over and over, and the kid will bring the book to the parent every night and say, I want to read it again. And admittedly, this can be a challenge. For one thing, the Bible isn't specifically a family-friendly book. The Old Testament is filled with stories about murder, adultery, sin in various forms. And besides that, how do you capture big picture concepts like redemption and sovereignty and the incarnation in a way that kids can understand it and it won't overwhelm them? And this process takes a lot of creativity, and that's why authors need our help sometimes. People can tend to think that writing books for children is really easy because the books are so short, but actually it can be even more difficult than books for adults, because you're trying to distill these big truths into a form that kids can grasp, and they need to be fun and winsome. Someone once asked Dr. Seuss about his writing process, and he said, "The problem with writing a book in verse is, to be successful, it has to sound like you knocked it off on a rainy Friday afternoon. It has to sound easy." But if you're a writer or an editor, you know that that is not the case when it comes to children's books, especially ones that rhyme. I worked with an author named Dandy Mackle on a series of storybooks recently, and this kind of storybook is unique because it tells the Bible story from two different perspectives. And I'll try and give you an idea here. It's called Jonah and the Fish, and from one side of the story, it tells from Jonah's point of view, and then if you flip the book over, it tells the same story, but from the fish's point of view. So we were really excited about this idea for this book. It's actually a series of 3 different books, also one about Zacchaeus and Jesus and one about the Good Shepherd and the sheep. So we loved her idea, but when we got the first draft in, it was just okay. And we've worked with this author long enough to know that she's an excellent writer, and we wanted to challenge her to stretch herself and to make this not just okay, but great. And so I proposed the idea to her, what would you think about rewriting this, but doing it in rhyme, doing it in poetry? And she sent me an email with the list of 17 reasons why there was no way that could work. And then she just decided to sleep on it. And that morning, I think at 5 a.m., she had written me the whole first stanza, and she said, "This was the breakthrough I needed. It's going to work." And I think there was something about the putting it in rhyme that actually helped her distill the emotions and the core of the story. And those parameters of rhyming actually helped her write a better book than she would have otherwise. And I'll read you just a little bit so you can get an idea how the book turned out. And the pictures are very fun too. So here's Jonah's side of the story. "I'm Jonah of Israel. Life was just great, till God told me something I chose to debate. Now go up to Nineveh, here's what to do. Just tell them I love them the way I love you. But I didn't like all those people up there, so here's what I said. God, I just do not care." And then it goes on to tell Jonah's side of the story, and then the fish has a slightly different perspective on how things went down. "I'm a mighty big fish in a mighty big sea. There I lived and I ruled and I swam worry-free. But I thought I was born for a deed brave and bold, and that deed hadn't come, though I'd grown very old." So as you can see, she rose to the challenge, and the book was better for it. Well, another thing an editor needs to do to help authors is to be ready to help an author when they get stuck. And I have another Dr. Seuss story for you. Dr. Seuss's editor in the 1960s was Michael Frith from Beginner Books. And when Dr. Seuss was beginning a project, he'd invite his editor over to his house, and they'd work all day and late into the evening. And when they got stuck or came down with a case of writer's block, Dr. Seuss would go into his living room and open this secret door in his bookcase. And behind the bookcase, there was a little closet full of all kinds of different hats, hundreds of hats, a sombrero, a Moroccan hat with a tassel, a Viking helmet with horns, any kind of hat, you name it, it was there. And each of them would choose a hat and put it on and sit down in the middle of the floor until an idea struck them. They felt like just putting on a new hat gave them new lens to see the world, and that was one of the ways that his editor helped him when he got stuck. Well, one of the unique aspects of children's books, I think, is that they tend to open themselves up to brainstorming more than adult books do. For one thing, children's books are written to be read aloud, so it can be very beneficial to do verbal brainstorming with another person. Now, you may not be able to have a little hat closet and sit down with your author in person and brainstorm, but that might be something you could do via Skype or over the phone or even over email. There is just something about the creative process especially when you're working with read aloud books and books with illustrations that can be really beneficial for the author. One of my favorite parts of being an editor is being able to come alongside an author and help them use the gifts that God has given them. And that's especially wonderful when you have an ongoing relationship and you've done multiple projects with an author. There's one author I've been working with for more than 10 years, and she's an excellent writer who can make readers laugh and also teach concepts in a kid-friendly way. And we were trying to brainstorm the next book for her to write, and she didn't really have any ideas, and we at Tyndale didn't really have ideas of what might be next for her. And so we decided to just bring her in-house for a morning of brainstorming. And we were just thinking, what are some things that this author loves? What are some things that she's passionate about? And what we realized pretty quickly was that she loves animals, and almost all of her books have animals in them in some form. And she also has horses and dogs and cats at her house as well. And so this was just a theme throughout her writing and her life. And as we started brainstorming some more, we realized that she loves the Bible too, and there are quite a few Bible stories that involve animals in some way. So we ended up with this idea of My Bible Animals Storybook, and it tells Bible stories, but kind of from the slant of the animals that were involved in those Bible stories. And I don't know if you can see this, but there's this one was about King David and the deer, how God makes our way perfect, as sure-footed as a deer. And then there are little deer facts, interesting little trivia about deer. And then there's questions that kids and parents can discuss together, and a key verse, and then a little prayer at the end. It turned out to be one of my favorite books that this author has done, partly because it's so much her heartbeat. And it was really fun to have that brainstorming process that gave way to that book. Another thing an editor needs to do is be able to inspire the author. Dr. Seuss's wife, Helen, was actually a children's author herself, as well as a book editor. And early in their relationship, she encouraged him to draw and write for a living. She was able to see the practical side for him, the writing and publishing side of things, but also she was able to give him courage he needed to make writing and art not just a hobby, but a career for him. And one of the unique challenges of editing children's books is that there are actually multiple audiences that the author is trying to keep in mind. With adult books, you typically have one audience. The buyer and the reader are usually the same person. But with children's books, you're actually trying to hit 3 different audiences. First, you have the buyer, who's the person who's going to be purchasing the book, choosing the book. It has to appeal to them. And then there's the person who's reading the book with the child, perhaps a parent or a grandparent or a teacher. And it needs to be enjoyable for the parent to read with the child as well. And then finally, there's the child, him or herself. And as the editor, you can help the author keep in mind what is important to each of those audiences. For the parent, it might be that they want to teach values to their children and help them grow spiritually and academically. For a grandparent, it might be that they want to get a gift for their child, pass on values to their child. Might even be that they want to spend time together, and having a book is a way that they could spend time together. For a child, more often than not, they just want an engaging story. They want something that they can connect with and relate to, maybe something that will make them laugh. And another thing that...
Stephanie,
yes.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Which slide would you like up right now?
Oh, sorry, we're on number 3. Yes, number 3, which is be able to inspire the author. Great.
Okay.
Another thing that's interesting about the audiences for children's books is that sometimes, obviously, we have the Christian audience, parents who are wanting to pass on spiritual truths to their children and bond with their children. But sometimes children's books also open themselves up to a more general audience. And there are people who may not read spiritual books for themselves, but they might want to pass on those values to their children, and it gives us a chance to reach adults through Christian children's books as well. And a key way to make sure your book is hitting the right target audience is to test it out on the actual audience. You might want to find children or teens in the demographic that your book is for and have them interact with it. So if you have a toddler who's squirming before you turn the page, it might be a sign to you that there are too many words on the page compared to the number of illustrations, and it might need to be adjusted. The number of words might need to be adjusted. Or if you have a teenager who's rolling her eyes when she's reading the book and saying that the writing feels dated, then it might be that you need to go back to the author to work on the tone of the book. And in terms of parents, it's helpful to know, to read blogs, talk to other parents and hear what issues are on their hearts, what they want for their children, and maybe even what seems to be a hole in the market. So just being in tune with those different audiences is one way that as an editor you can really help your author make sure that they're hitting those three audiences. Number 4, the last way to make sure you are serving your author is to be in tune with the author. Kathy Goldsmith was Dr. Seuss's last editor at Random House, and Dr. Seuss died in 1991. And about 20 years later, in 2013, his widow found an unpublished manuscript and sketches for Which Pet Should I Get, the book I read an excerpt from at the beginning. And Goldsmith was given the task of publishing this work and doing it in a way that Dr. Seuss would have approved of. It was still unfinished. It hadn't been edited. There were just sketches, but no final illustrations. So she had to rely on her knowledge of his preferences, on all the little details that he would have cared about, from the end sheets to the punctuation, even to the color choices. And she knew him well enough to know what he would want and how he would respond to art decisions and content decisions. And that's a good reminder to us that as an editor, you are a mediator of sorts. You're advocating for the reader, you're also advocating for the publishing house, and you're advocating for the author. And when you're wearing the reader hat, you're making sure the message is clear and engaging, both for children and adults. And when you're advocating for the publishing house, you're making sure the book is communicating a message that the company is proud to stand behind. And when you're advocating for the author, you're making sure the message is true to the author and what they're trying to communicate as well. And then for us as believers, I think there's a final and ultimate source that we're responsible to, and that's the Lord. We want to make sure the message of the book is communicating His truth and His grace to everyone who reads it. I worked closely with the author of this book, Be Still, and I knew her heart for this book. It's a really simple book that helps kids memorize scripture, but it's not just to help them memorize by rote without knowing what the meaning is. It also unpacks every word of the verse and then helps it go from the kids' heads to their hearts. So they have it memorized, but they also connect with it emotionally. And I knew this author felt really strongly about the art. Since there are very few words in the book, it was really important that the illustrations would communicate the tone as well. And the designer brought in sample illustrations for this book, and they were adorable. Very cute kids and lots of action and energy, but I could tell right away that it didn't capture the tone that the author was looking for. So the verse that's featured in this book is Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God." And she really wanted it to be a restful, peaceful kind of tone. And the illustrations were just there was too much happening, too much vibrancy, too much energy. And so although it was cute, I wanted to advocate for the author and say, I think we need something that fits with her words more. And what we came up with, I think, is just a perfect, really peaceful kind of art that's winsome but fits the tone really well. And I'll kind of show you so you can get an idea of what it's like. As you can see, there's not a lot of text on each page. The first page is just B. And you can see the illustrations are very sweet and soft, and they evoke the tone she is going for. Be kind, be silly, be a friend, be yourself. Be still. Shh. Slow down. Take a breath. No hurrying or scurrying or worrying. No wanting or whining. No fussing, no rushing. Safe and still. So you can see that was a way that we can sorry about that. I don't know what happened. So anyway, those are some of the ways that we can be an advocate for the author when editing children's books. And I would love to hear if anyone else has other tips for editing children's books. And as you're thinking about that, feel free to put in comments in the chat section. I sent you, you should have gotten the 2 handouts, the childhood developmental stages and the children's book editing checklist. And this session was called The Art of Editing Children's Books. And that was intentional. It is an art. It's hard to break it down into a formula or science. So there's not just a simple 1, 2, 3 step magic way to edit. But I think these tools might help you with some more practical ways that you can help your authors as you're editing. The childhood developmental stages breaks down where children are at infancy, preschool, middle grade, and young adult, what they're able to access on a spiritual level and an emotional level, so that you're making sure that your books are hitting them at their felt need. And I also have some resources on that page that will get into more depth on some of those issues. And then the children's book editing list is also gives some tips about things you can look for as you're editing. So I would love to hear if any of you have questions or ideas of things that have worked well for you in terms of editing yourself. So I'll kind of take a look at some of your questions and see if I can answer some of those for you. So one of the questions here is, do artists and those helping with illustrations have to undergo a special training for children's books so they'll provide adequate illustrations? Let's see. That's a good question. I think it depends on the illustrator. There are some illustrators we work with who have had training and formal education in children's books. But I think one of the main ways that illustrators become good at what they do is just by looking at what else is out there for that age group that they're working with, and then finding their own style. We try not to just imitate what is already out there. We can use that as a reference point and then find ways to make it fresh and engaging for children and for parents. So I don't think that there's usually special training, but maybe just an awareness of what else is out there for that age group. Great question. Next question is, how do you know which age group to write to and age ranges? I think it really depends on what your goal is. There might be, a lot of our authors have direct contact with children in some form, whether that's their own children or maybe they teach Sunday school or they have real-time audience that they're working with. So it's not just a theoretical, I want to write for kids. So I think they can be really in tune with what that age group needs, what parents that in that age of children that age want, and then they can speak directly to that need. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Barb, but that's a great question. Next question, how do you deal with writing for children things they're not interested in but which you know they need? such as self-defense against sexual perverts, issues of social injustice, etc.? Well, that's a good question. I think there are ways that we can tailor a message so that you're communicating truth to children, and then leaving space for parents to add more detail or go into more depth if they want to. I know we have a series of books that are kind of big theological questions that children might ask, such as what is heaven? And in the book, What is Heaven, there is, reference to what happens when people die. And you obviously don't want to make children more fearful than they need to be, but we also want to provide answers for parents. When kids ask difficult questions, we want to provide a resource for them that they can give them a starting point, and then they can go into more depth if they want to. So I hope that helps you answer that. We have not done anything specifically about self-defense, so that might be a really good thing for you to think about as well. Next question. At what stage of the editing process do you test the book with kids? Do you also show sample illustrations? Great question. Typically, we have several stages of the illustrations. We usually finish the text first, and then we commission the illustrations after the book has been edited. The reason for that is because often during the editing process, something might change in the text, and then you're in a spot of having to either change the illustrations or get new illustrations. So it's much better if you wait until it's edited. So we tend to, after the edits are done, we tend to do little storyboard with kind of just stick figure illustrations that the designer creates and then sends to the illustrator, and then has the illustrator create sketches based on those, the storyboard. And then at that stage is when we might show it to the test audience. And it's not in color at that point, so it's not the full effect, but it's usually enough to get an idea. And then at that point, there's still room to change. Once the illustrations are then sent back to the illustrator to be colorized, then it's kind of too late to make changes without it being expensive. So that's why we don't wait until the very end. Great question. Next question. I'd like to write a children's book for a general audience, middle grade. Is it okay if I just show Christian values without mentioning the Bible? That's a great question. I think it really depends on your publishing house and what their stance is of how overt you want to be. I think there are also some cultural implications to be considered. I think there is definitely a place for writing fiction from a Christian worldview that teaches Christian values. And even if it's not explicitly Christian, I think there's definitely a place for that. It creates openness for people who might not read a blatantly Christian book, who can enjoy the book and kind of learn from it, even if they don't mention the name of Jesus. And I think that would be a good conversation to have with the publishing house to find out what their stance is and how explicit they want the book to be. Great question. Next question. Sorry if I'm cutting out. I'm trying to make sure I speak into my microphone here. Next question. How can one combat issues of children's illustrations where cartoon characters are used and yet help them see Christian matters as serious and true, not fantasy or fairy tales? That's a great question. I would say when we're illustrating Bible stories in particular, we try to be really careful to make sure that the illustrations are biblically accurate. And there are a lot of cases where that affects how the illustrator is doing the illustrating. So for example, you might often see angels being depicted as being kind of like cute, childlike creatures with halos and We try to make sure that it's true to Scripture, which is, every time somebody saw an angel in Scripture, they were a little bit terrified. So not that we want to terrify children with the pictures of angels, but we want to make sure we're being true to what Scripture says, and not producing just kind of a, like you said, a cartoon version of what the Bible stories are like. And I think sometimes the tone can be more playful depending on the style of the writing, but we do try to make it as theologically accurate as possible. Next question. So the storyboard comes from the book designer, not the illustrator. That's correct. That's at least how we do it here. At Tyndale, we have a vision for the book, for both the writing and the illustrations, and then we pay an illustrator to kind of help us fulfill that vision. And that way we can make sure we're getting what we want, and making sure that the book follows the vision that we have acquired. So usually, you're right, we get the text first, and then we have the designer create the storyboard from that. Next question, do we need children to proofread the book we edit? In what stage can we get feedback from the children? I would say to get feedback from the children would be not so much for proofreading, but just to see if they're engaged with the text. Are they laughing at the funny parts? Are they connecting with the characters? Are they sitting still and enjoying it? And obviously not every book is for every kid, but it will kind of give you an idea of if you're on the right track. And again, that would be something I would do when the sketches come and the text is kind of laid out in the page, unless it's for an older child, in which case they could read it at an earlier stage. Next question, do you accept scripts from people outside the US for editing and publishing? If yes, what are the criteria you use? I would say in general in the United States, there's a desire for more cross-cultural writing, and I think people are very interested in how people live in different parts of the world, and they want to understand what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. So there is definitely an openness to hearing stories from people in different parts of the world, and I would say Tyndale's open to that. I don't personally do acquiring, but I think the main thing for aspiring writers to know is that in order to get into a major publishing house, it's best to get an agent. So that would probably be the best place to start. Next question, do you let the author have a say about the illustrations? Oh, that is a great question. This is kind of a tricky part of the process because some authors have very strong opinions about what the illustrations will look like. Others are just open to our expertise, and some are just grateful to have another outside opinion to give them direction. I would say it depends on the author. In general, according to the contract, they don't have a right to speak into the illustrations, but we also want them to be happy with the illustrations, and we want to make sure that it fits with what they would imagine. So typically when we're in the process, we choose 3 illustrators that we think would potentially fit with the style of the writing that we think would be a good match. And we might send a sample of that illustrator's illustrations to the author and say, this is what the direction we were thinking about going. Is this in line with what you would imagine? So we try to get feedback early on, and then if they really don't like that style, then we would go a different direction and get their input. So yeah, great question. Any tips on how to edit rhyme? Oh, this is such a good question. Editing rhyme is one of the hardest tests an editor will face. And Joanna, it sounds like maybe you've done this before, because it's difficult. If you change just one word in a line of rhyme, you almost have to rewrite the entire rhyme, the both lines, or because it all falls apart. So it's very challenging. I use a tool that's called rhymezone.com, and it has, you just type in a word and it tells you all the words that rhyme with it, however many syllables it is, and that helps. And I would say it depends on the writer. There are some writers who are excellent and they love to rhyme. I think rhyming is something you either have inherently or you don't. It's a really hard skill to teach author to do. So if you have an author who's not a rhymer, don't try and push them into it. So there are some authors I work with who I will just say, this line isn't working because of this. Could you rework it? And there are other writers who struggle a little bit more that I might provide sample text and say, what do you think about rewriting this, and give them a couple of options of rhymes that might work. So it just depends on the author. Okay, let's see, next question. Is it okay to use real pictures for illustrations in children's books? And I would say there are so many different styles of illustrations, and it just depends on what the writing is like. The main thing you want to do is make sure that the writing and the illustrations or the photographs complement each other, and that they have the same tone and they're communicating the message you want to communicate. And if photographs are the best way to do that, I think that is absolutely fine. What do you use if the author does not? What do you do if the author does not agree with the editor's suggestions? Great question. I think one of the main goals I always have as an editor is to, from the beginning, let the author know that you're on the same team, and just remind them that your goal is both the same. Your goal is to make this book the best it can be, the easiest for children to understand, and the most engaging and winsome it can be, and ultimately communicate the message of God's truth the best way it can. So I think when you start with that as a premise, that usually helps facilitate the relationship and the conversation. And I think sometimes maybe an author will come up with an idea, and then as an editor I'll come up with a suggested change, and then if the author doesn't really like the change, then maybe we come up with a third way or a fourth way that is perhaps better than either of us could have come up with on our own. And there are some times when there's a standstill and neither of you can figure out a solution, and there may become a point when the author's name is the one who's on it, and you have to just present the different alternatives to them and remember that it's their book ultimately. I think another thing that's helpful is that it's not just your word versus the author's word, but it's how it's going to affect the audience. And so if you can take it from an angle that's less personal, but it's more about, when this child who's 5 is going to read this, here's how they're going to think about it. And that may be a place where you can bring in your test audience, and that might help. So it's not just your word against the author's word. Next question. What was the most challenging children's book that you edited, and why? Oh, that's a good question. Let's see. There was one author I worked with who is a pretty well-known adult author, and she had done lots of writing for adults, very gifted writer for adults, but I would say her style was very abstract and lyrical, and it didn't really translate very well for children. And she had written a Christmas book, and they wanted her to do a children's edition of the adult book. And it was really difficult for her to kind of come down to a child's level and say, okay, how can this concretely make sense for children in this age group? And fortunately, she was really open to feedback. And one of the things we had to do right from the beginning was we had to cut down, it was a daily Advent devotional. We had to cut down the text to probably a third of what the original she sent in. And that was really difficult, just to cut so much work that she'd done and try and trim it down to a manageable level for kids. And I think the ultimate project or the ultimate product turned out even longer than it should have been still. So there are times when you just can only do so much. But yeah, good question. Next question. I've always felt sorry for editors. Their names do not show up on the back of the book, no matter how hard they worked. Is it taken care of in their training? Oh, let's see. I love being an editor. I can't speak for editors as a whole, but I think there's something so rewarding about coming behind someone and being their cheerleader, their coach, and just helping them shine. And so for me, the reward is the finished product, but also just the relationship you get to build with the author and know that you helped make this possible. And the funny thing about being an editor is that really people don't notice you unless you miss something. So if you do things well, then you should be invisible. But if it's only when you miss something that someone notices. But I think there's also some spiritual parallels with that, just how we can come alongside each other as friends and believers and encourage each other, not for glory, but ultimately for God's kingdom. So. Next question. Did the author write another children's book after that? Good question. Not so far. I'm not sure if that's in the plans or not, but so far, no. Next question. What is the most rewarding part about editing children's books for you? Oh, I think my absolute favorite part is having a finished book and then giving it to a child I know and being able to read it with them and see the impact that that book can have. I remember so many books from my own childhood that were formative for me in my spiritual growth, and I love being able to be part of that and pass that on to other people. All right. Any other questions? I think we're kind of nearing the end of our time, but if there are any final thoughts or questions, I'd love to hear them.
Stephanie, I have one question as we kind of pull it to a close. Some of us may be working in places where perhaps children's books aren't given, a real high priority in the context of all the other things that are published. What could you tell us as we encourage, our publishing houses and others about the importance of publishing quality books for kids?
Great question. Yes, publishing for children is difficult, and for one thing, it can be very expensive because you have to pay an illustrator and a writer, and then you also have the costs of four-color interior and just a lot of additional costs. And so on paper, sometimes it doesn't look like the most lucrative part of publishing. I would say one thing about children's books is that they tend to have a much longer shelf life than adult books. They stay a lot longer. Adult books tend to turn over really quickly, and kids' books can stay on the list for a really long time. And I think on a deeper level, it's such a wonderful way to pass on truth to children, and knowing that this is the next generation of believers who are coming up. And when they can understand truths about God from a young age, just think about how much that's going to impact the kingdom for eternity. So, and maybe also just pray for those books, pray that God will get them in the hands of the parents and the children who need them. And I think He will honor that prayer.
Great. Right. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I think we're going to pull it to a close. I want to thank everybody for your excellent questions, too. I think it really fleshed out a lot of things that Stephanie was sharing today. So, again, I'm so grateful. MEI is grateful, and our friends around the world are grateful that you would lead us in this really important topic today, Stephanie.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So appreciated your questions and your thoughtful comments.
Great. Okay, goodbye, everybody. Thanks so much. Thank you, Stephanie. Bye.
Thank you.